I'm 35 years old, and I've been married to Daniel for 12 years. We have two children, Sophia and Oliver, and from the outside, everything seems perfect. But as they say, appearances can be deceiving. Over time, our life with Daniel has turned into a routine, and I feel like I'm living someone else's life. It's as if something important between us has been lost. When we got married, I was full of enthusiasm. Looking back on those early years, it felt magical. Our conversations, our travels, our little traditions. Daniel was the person I trusted with my heart, and I thought it would be like that forever. But now, when I reflect on our life, I feel emptiness. I tried to bring back the spark, cooking his favorite meals, arranging evenings just for the two of us, but it didn't change the core issue. Daniel seemed like a different person. He was physically there, but his thoughts, his heart seemed far away. We talked about the kids, about work, but no longer about us. I started to feel like we were just roommates, not husband and wife. Every morning, I wake up hoping that this day will change something, but the same rituals and conversations repeat again and again. It pains me to realize that there's now a wall between us, and I don't know how to break it down. One evening, after our usual dinner, Daniel shared some news that made me feel slightly uneasy. "Laura, I have some news. Mark, my older brother, will be moving in with us for a while. He recently got divorced and doesn't have a place to stay." I tried to hide my surprise. I knew that Mark had been having problems in his marriage, but I didn't expect things to go this far. "Divorced?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah. He's having a tough time right now, so I offered for him to stay with us until he finds a new place. He's a good guy, and I think being with family will help," Daniel continued, not noticing the unease growing inside me. The next day, Mark arrived. He looked different from how I remembered him. Tall, confident, with a light smile on his face, he appeared energetic despite the recent divorce. His presence sharply contrasted with the dullness that had settled over my marriage with Daniel. We exchanged greetings, and he gave me a friendly smile. But in that moment, something strange flickered in my mind. I found myself drawn to his confidence and strength. Days passed, and I started noticing him more and more. Every gesture, every word he spoke seemed full of life. It stood in stark contrast to Daniel's recent emotional withdrawal. I began to feel a strange sense of attraction toward Mark. It was something forbidden, something I couldn't and didn't want to acknowledge. Every time our eyes met, I felt a slight flutter, though I tried to suppress it. But the more I tried to ignore these thoughts, the more they consumed me. I knew I couldn't allow myself to go down this path. But each day it became harder and harder to resist. A few weeks had passed since Mark moved in with us. We started spending more and more time together, and I couldn't help but notice how easy it was to talk to him. With him, I felt heard and understood, something I hadn't felt with Daniel in a long time. Mark listened to me with genuine interest, asking about my life, about the kids. It was easy to be honest with him, and he became someone I could trust. The days flowed by, and our conversations grew deeper. We talked about our fears, hopes, and dreams. I told him things I had never shared with Daniel. It was a strange feeling, this closeness with someone who wasn't my husband. But it was exactly this closeness I felt with Mark that made me even more confused about my feelings. The attraction between us grew stronger each day. We didn't touch, we didn't speak about what connected us, but our glances said more than words ever could. Mark didn't make any moves to cross a line, but I could feel that he was just as aware of our connection as I was. I felt ashamed that I had feelings for my husband's brother. I didn't want to destroy my family, but despite that, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every night I went to bed with thoughts of Mark, fighting with myself not to give in to this attraction. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Mark and I sat in the living room. He told me how hard the divorce had been for him, how lonely he felt. I felt pity for him, but at the same time, it opened something deeper inside me. I reached out my hand to comfort him, and our fingers barely touched. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but I knew something had changed. It wasn't just a friendly gesture. It was something more. Lately, a cold wall had grown between me and Daniel. It felt like we were living in different worlds, even though we were under the same roof. I wanted to bring back the feelings that had once bound us together, to feel close again, but I didn't know where to start. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I decided to make the first move. I put on Daniel's favorite lingerie, prepared a light dinner, and lit candles, hoping that it might help us reconnect. I waited for him in the bedroom, hoping he would understand my gesture. When Daniel entered the room, I saw surprise flash across his face. He stopped at the door as if unsure how to react. I walked over to him, trying not to let my disappointment show. "I miss us," I whispered, trying to catch his gaze. But instead of the warmth I expected, I felt him pull away. His body tensed and he slowly distanced himself from my touch. "I can't, Laura," he said quietly, his voice filled with pain. My heart froze. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to understand what was happening. In his eyes, I saw something I hadn't noticed before: shame and fear. After a long pause, Daniel confessed. "I have erectile dysfunction. It's been going on for months. I've been taking medication, but nothing's worked. I didn't know how to tell you." His words hit me like a blow to the chest. I didn't know what to say. All the coldness I had felt over the past months finally had an explanation, but it brought no relief. I felt empty and lost. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "We could have faced this together. I was afraid you wouldn't see me as a man anymore, that you'd leave me." His words were full of pain and fear. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. Not knowing how to handle this new reality, I just left, leaving him behind. I needed space to process everything. My heart was breaking, and I didn't know what to do next. I couldn't sleep that night. After Daniel's confession, the emptiness inside me only grew. I paced around the house trying to figure out how to cope with all the emotions overwhelming me. I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. All I knew was that I couldn't bear being alone with this despair any longer. My footsteps led me to Mark's door. In the darkness, I froze in front of it, realizing I was on the verge of something inevitable. In that moment, I knew this was a line I shouldn't cross. But I couldn't stop. The pain, the loneliness, it was all too much. I knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if Mark had been waiting for me. Our eyes met, and I saw in his gaze the same thing I felt: desperation and desire. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside to let me in. That night passed in a blur. I didn't think about the consequences, about how this betrayal would destroy my life. I just wanted to forget, to feel something that could fill the emptiness I'd been experiencing for months. When morning came, reality hit me with full force. I woke up next to Mark, and a wave of horror washed over me. What had I done? I knew it was wrong, that I had betrayed Daniel. My mind was racing, but I didn't know how to return to my normal life, how to face Daniel. I quickly got up from the bed, ready to leave, but Mark stopped me. "You realize, Laura, that everything has changed now?" His voice was quiet, but there was a threat in it. I froze, unable to believe what he was saying. "What do you mean?" He looked at me, and I saw something new in his eyes, cold and calculating. "You can't just walk away and pretend nothing happened. If you try to distance yourself, I'll tell Daniel everything." Those words hit me harder than I could have imagined. I stood there, paralyzed with fear. Mark was blackmailing me, threatening to destroy what little was left of my life. I felt trapped, not knowing how to escape this situation. I thought I could find a way to distance myself from Mark, if only for my own peace of mind. After that night, the guilt and fear of what might happen if Daniel found out wouldn't leave me. But one day, everything changed. When I came home from work, Mark was sitting on the couch, and across from him was a woman I didn't immediately recognize. She looked elegant, with a light smile on her face, and her presence in our home puzzled me. "Laura, meet Rachel," Mark said easily, as if this was just a casual meeting of old friends. Rachel, Mark's ex-wife. I felt everything inside me tense up. She had come with the intention of rekindling her relationship with him. He hadn't told me anything about her, and I didn't know how to react. The situation had just become even more complicated. Rachel seemed more confident than I expected. Her manners, her calm voice, it all irritated me. I felt a surge of jealousy, something I hadn't anticipated. I realized that my feelings for Mark were far more complicated than I had thought. It wasn't just a fleeting attraction during moments of weakness. Now I was afraid of losing him. They laughed, discussing something from their past, and I suddenly felt out of place in the room. But what shocked me even more was the fear. The fear that Rachel could win Mark back, that they might be together again, and everything that had happened between me and Mark would just be a passing episode for him. In the following days, Rachel started coming over more often to talk to Mark. I tried to keep calm, pretending that it didn't bother me, but inside I was boiling. She had no idea what had happened between me and Mark, and her ignorance only heightened my internal tension. I didn't know what to do. Stay away or fight for something that had long since become forbidden. After Rachel stayed with us for a few hours and left, the house was once again filled with its usual silence. I tried to convince myself that her visit didn't matter, that it didn't change anything. But with each minute spent near Mark, my emotions surged like waves. He was still here, right beside me, and the feelings inside me were boiling over, impossible to ignore any longer. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I couldn't contain my emotions any longer. I walked into the kitchen where Mark was. We exchanged glances, and in that moment, all the tension I'd been carrying broke free. I moved closer, and our lips met. It was a quick but passionate kiss, filled with all the emotions we could no longer hide. I was so consumed by the moment that I didn't notice Sophia standing by the door. Her wide eyes watched us in the dim light. I had no idea she was there, seeing everything. At that moment, all that existed for me was Mark and that fleeting kiss. The next day, I felt strange, like something was off, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Later that evening, when Daniel came home from work, I noticed that he was thoughtful. Sophia seemed unusually quiet and distant, which wasn't typical for her. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Daniel came up to me. "Did you notice something strange about Sophia today?" he asked. His voice was filled with doubt. "She told me something that made me think." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What did she say?" I tried to keep my voice calm. "She said she saw you and Mark in the kitchen last night, too close to each other." His words hit me like a bolt of lightning. I tried to come up with an excuse, but I could already see the suspicion in his eyes. After that conversation, Daniel started noticing more and more details. He became more attentive to how Mark and I interacted, though he didn't voice any open accusations. His silence was even worse. It pierced me every time he looked at me. I could feel the wall between us growing higher with each passing day. After that evening when Sophia saw Mark and me, everything started to fall apart. Daniel was no longer the same. His silence became heavy and suffocating. I felt that I could no longer hide the truth. The lies and fear were choking me from the inside. Every word he spoke, every look he gave me was filled with distrust. I knew I had to do it. I had to confess everything, no matter the pain it would cause. I realized our relationship would never be the same, but I couldn't live in the shadow of this betrayal anymore. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I made my decision. Daniel was sitting at the table as if he already knew what I was about to say. I sat down across from him, trying to gather my thoughts. My chest tightened with fear and guilt. "Daniel, I need to tell you the truth," I began, and his face immediately tensed. He didn't reply, just looked at me, waiting. I took a deep breath, summoning all my strength. "I cheated on you. With Mark." My words hung in the air. The room fell into a deafening silence. I saw the surprise and confusion flash in his eyes first, and then deep pain. He slowly lowered his head, covering his face with his hands. I sat there, watching his world fall apart, knowing I was the one who shattered it. "How could you?" His voice was quiet, as if he couldn't believe what he had heard. "With my brother?" I couldn't answer. Inside, everything was screaming, but the words were stuck in my throat. I knew that any explanation would only sound like an excuse. "I'm to blame," I finally whispered. "But I don't know how we got here. There was a wall between us, and I felt like you weren't with me anymore." His eyes filled with tears, but he didn't let them fall. "You think that justifies what you did?" "No," I replied. "It doesn't justify anything. But it's the truth." He was silent for a long time before finally speaking again. "I'm at fault too. I pulled away from you. I pushed you away. I couldn't be the husband you deserve." His voice trembled, and I could see how hard this was for him. That evening, I left for another room, leaving Daniel alone with his pain. I didn't know what would happen next, and I was terrified of the future. The next morning, Mark found out about our conversation. He came into my room and sat beside me. "You did the right thing," he said. "Now we need to decide what to do next. Let's leave. We can start over, far away from all this chaos." His proposal hung in the air, like the ghost of a chance for a fresh start. But I didn't know what to choose. On one side was Daniel, our family, and the wreckage of what had been. On the other was Mark and the possibility of a new life. I was lost in my own doubts and fears, unsure of what to do next. A few days had passed since Mark had proposed we leave together. Those days were some of the hardest of my life. I stood at a crossroads where every choice felt wrong. But one morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I could no longer live in the shadow of this deceit. I realized that I had to try to rebuild what I had broken. I met with Mark in the living room. His eyes were full of hope, but I knew I had to tell him the truth. "Mark, I can't leave with you," I began, feeling the weight of those words. "I've made too many mistakes, and I need to fix them. I have to try to save my marriage with Daniel." He stared at me for a long time, as if trying to process my words. I saw his expression shift from hope to disappointment. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I replied. "I can't continue this. It's not right." Mark nodded, accepting my choice. "If that's truly what you want, I respect your decision." He left the house later that evening, and I felt a part of the burden inside me lift. When I approached Daniel to talk, he was surprised. I suggested we try couples therapy, knowing that it would be a long and difficult road. "I know you don't have to forgive me," I said, trying to hold back tears. "But I want to try to fix what I broke. Can we try therapy?" Daniel was silent for a long time, considering my words. Finally, he slowly nodded. "We can try," he said. His voice was filled with doubt, but at the same time, I felt that he wasn't ready to give up. And so, we began therapy. It was incredibly hard at first. Daniel couldn't forgive me right away, and every session was filled with pain and distrust. He asked questions that were difficult for me to answer. I knew that each of his questions was soaked in the pain I had caused him. But over time, although it was incredibly tough, we started to see small improvements. We began to understand each other better, even though the weight of the past still hung over us. It was a long and painful process, but every little step forward felt like a victory. Slowly, step by step, we started to build a new relationship. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something more mature, more thoughtful. We both understood that it would take time to rebuild trust, but we were willing to work toward it. Several months had passed since Daniel and I started therapy. It had been difficult at first. We were both filled with pain and doubts, but slowly, step by step, I began to notice that something was changing between us. These changes were subtle, but they were there. Daniel and I began communicating more. We no longer just discussed everyday concerns or the kids. We started talking about what bothered us, about our feelings, about what had been missing in our relationship over the years. We learned to listen to each other, and that gave us a new foundation for rebuilding our marriage. Our marriage no longer felt perfect, as it had in the beginning, but it had become deeper and more conscious. There was now more honesty and mutual support between us. We both understood that this was a long road and that trust wouldn't be restored overnight, but every day felt like a small step forward. Mark, realizing that his presence could only hurt our family, decided to leave town. We didn't speak after that. Inside me, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I now had more space to work on my marriage, and sadness that I had lost someone who had once been so close to me. But despite those complex emotions, I knew I had made the right choice. Daniel and I continued to build our new marriage, one founded on honesty that we had lacked before. We both realized that in order to sustain a relationship, we needed to work on it every day. Now, every conversation, every decision we made was through the lens of respect for each other and the awareness of the importance of support. We had learned not only to speak, but to hear each other. I knew that our journey was far from over. Rebuilding trust takes time. But I knew we were ready for that challenge now, and that this new stage of our life would make us stronger.